君の中にある赤と青き線それらが結ばれるのは真の像
I have one question for you. What would it take for you to want to leave this world behind into another one? What would that new world need to have in it to make it so exciting that you would want to jump on it if you could? In my opinion, world building can only be considered good if the world created is either some awesome place that anyone would want to go and experience, or some place nobody would ever want to touch with a 10-foot stick. World building goes beyond just making a simple story from point A to point B. You get to orchestrate the way your world operates. And when done right, people really dive into it and get immersed in every single nook and cranny. It turns the reader's love for the characters you created into an obsession with the world you designed. But here's the thing, just because you can create every single detail doesn't mean you necessarily should. There's a fine line between creating an immersive world and overwhelming yourself and your readers with too much unnecessary information. Sure, you see a lot of the cliché our world, but with RPG elements in webcomics, as well as the nebulous kingdom of political unclearness for the princess protagonist to have her romantic adventures in. God, I hate romance comics. But sometimes, just sometimes, you come across something truly special when it comes to world building, and you are never able to forget it. You start with a simple concept, and before you know it, you've gone down your own rabbit hole. And you're writing intricate stories for civilizations that existed millennia before your story even begins. You've got detail maps, political systems, calendars, languages, and maybe an economic breakdown that happened. And it seems like it's a great idea, right? To think about everything, every detail, but not really, because it can actually damage your story and the reader's experiences. Because you have to ask yourself, is it all essential for the story? Because let me be real, let me be very real right now. By default, nobody cares about your world building and ideas. Really, nobody cares. What they might care about are the characters and their dynamics, especially if they can relate to these characters, remembering their own life experiences and projecting into the characters. And once they care about the characters, then they will start to care just a little about the world they live in. And this interest increases gradually. A lot of people get this wrong because it's very easy to get trapped in the world builder syndrome, where you're so focused on developing the world that you lose track of the actual story that people want to read. You don't want to end up with pages upon pages of lore that might never even make it to your comic. Remember, the goal is to enhance the story, not to drown it with unnecessary details. The key is finding that balance between creativity and what actually pushes the plot forward. World building can go very wrong if you're not careful. One of the biggest mistakes creators make is building a world that feels disconnected from the story and its characters. You've probably seen this before. A world with tons of rules, fancy names and intricate systems, but none of it feels relevant to what's happening on screen. The characters end up wandering through environments that don't add any emotional weight or stakes to the plot, and are there just to be a backdrop. And these are also usually very generic ones at that, making the whole thing feel shallow and boring. If the world doesn't serve the story, it can leave your readers confused, detached, or worse, they might just leave and forget the comic. I've had some friends drop great anime like Attack on Titan just because they didn't care about the expanded world building on regions like Marley and Eldia. And I was like, no, just try and understand the lore. I promise it will be worth it, but they just gave up. So you see how real this is. We all know that in webcomics, if you lose your audience attention for a millisecond, it's game over. That's the nature of the internet, sadly, these days. So when showcasing your world, there's always the need to have something everyone can find interesting, like a lowest common denominator type of thing. There are two main approaches, soft and hard world building. Hard world building involves creating a detailed, consistent framework on how the world operates, with clear rules governing its magic systems, politics, geography, and technology. This method prioritizes internal logic and consistency, so that readers can understand and anticipate how the world's mechanics work. This is good for big franchises that want to create a lot of different stories in the same universe. On the other hand, soft world building focuses less on rigid structures and more on the overall atmosphere, mood, and the themes of the story. The rules in soft world building are often vague and flexible. Soft world building often serves the plot and characters entirely, adjusting itself to whatever best fits the narrative at any given point in time. Like the world exists just for the characters and the tale being told. It allows creators to make it up as they go, shaping the world to suit the emotional and thematic needs of the characters at any given moment. A soft world allows for creative solutions and symbolic landscapes, or magical moments that perfectly align with what the story demands emotionally, without needing to stop and explain how it all fits into a pre-existing framework. In this way, the world becomes a tool for expressing the internal journey of the characters. Like, imagine the main guy is sad, so he takes a trip to the sorrow caves that you, the writer, just made up. This flexible approach allows the world to evolve alongside the story, creating a fluid and dynamic setting, rather than being restricted by hard rules. It's good if you want to make like an emotional story. One Piece, for example, is kinda weird, because Oda is obviously making up most of the world as he goes, but once he establishes something, it is set in stone and he never forgets it. Oda created this massive sprawling world, but he reveals it bit by bit as the story needs it. At first, it's just about Luffy wanting to be a pirate king and joking around in East Blue, but as we move along, we start learning about the world government, the emperors, and all that. But it's only when it's relevant to the plot. You don't get a giant info dump up front about how the entire world government operates, because it will be overwhelming and boring, right? Instead, you get these pieces of world building that enhance the story as it progresses, and sometimes a map for you to see the oceans, but not always. Just let it breathe and grow as the reader gets more interested. But you also can't just toss in random elements without thinking about how they fit together, because your world needs cohesion. Let's say you're introducing a new power system, like Nen in Hunter x Hunter. What you gotta consider is how Nen fits into the world itself. There are consequences to using it. The world of Hunter x Hunter doesn't just throw in Nen and call it a day. It weaves it into the larger fabric of society, politics, and even the economy to some level. Because in good world building, everything is connected in some way, including the powers and abilities of the characters. Everything in your world should interact and make sense together. If you add in something like magic, technology, or superpowers, make sure it ripples out into the other aspects of your world. Essentially, you should know way more about your world than your readers do at any moment. Or at least pretend and show little glimpses of things that you haven't actually really thought out too deeply, but are there just to make it seem like you did. Even when you're the god of your story with every little detail in your head, your readers still only need to see the tip of the iceberg. When you watch One Piece, you get the sense that the world is much bigger than what you're seeing. And that's the magic of great world building. You create the illusion of a huge complex world without drowning your readers in info. Many people think that a deep, well-made fictional world is just literally a lot of interconnected lore, but that's not really it. Good world building in practice is an interesting backdrop with an illusion of depth. It serves to complement the characters, not overwhelm the pages and the mind space of the reader. And another important tip, keep your best wild ideas always present in the narrative, but make sure they connect logically. This is what makes world building fun, tying the crazy ideas back into the world in meaningful ways, making so that the concepts are always present. Also remember, don't worry too much about realism. Manga and webcomics are full of absurdity. Time travel, gods of destruction, people who can blow up planets, but people still manage to take the narratives seriously and relate to the characters, because the world has its own internal logic. Fans buy into it because the rules of the world make sense within the story. In manga, readers are more than willing to accept bizarre, over-the-top elements, as long as they feel like they fit into the larger world you created. That's so simple, but people just don't seem to get it. You hear it all the time when discussing manga. Oh, but it's a world where people can fly, it doesn't have to make sense. Of course it does. It has to make sense within the confines of internal logic of the story. Otherwise, there's no point. Lately, it feels like webcomic world building is becoming incredibly rigid in their approach. I mean, many creators have ended up making their worlds feel like stock settings, often just making them either a regular world city, like a Korean city, or just a generic medieval RPG setting. The point of this approach is to help readers quickly understand the setting and immerse themselves in the story quickly. However, there's always that risk of doing it too much. Either your story is so interesting that the generic setting doesn't get in the way, or you build an interesting world. When I see that establishing shot 3D city, I already roll my eyes. The best advice I can give is to focus on what matters most to your story. If you're writing an adventure webcomic like One Piece, think about how the world's geography impacts the journey. If your comic is more about martial arts battles, focus on how the power systems or training methods work. And if your story's got intricate politics or heists, build out the social and political structures that influence your character's actions and really think them through. At the end of the day, world building is simply about creating a backdrop that lets your characters and story do what it wants to do. Start with what matters most, and then let the rest of the world build out naturally. You don't need to explain every single detail. Just give your readers enough to make the world feel real and full of life. I have a course for creating webcomics, and all I can say now is, the best is yet to come.